On January 3rd, 2026, US Delta forces illegally abducted the Venezuelan president Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores and brought them to New York to stand trial for narco-terrorism charges. Maduro pleaded not guilty in the Manhattan federal court on January 5th, calling himself a prisoner of war and denying US jurisdiction over his illegal abduction on sovereign soil. Joining us today is Zoe Alexandra. Zoe is a journalist, author, and editor at the People's Dispatch. She will trace the chain of events that brought Nicolas Maduro to New York and what it means for New York City, where the case is expected to play out in federal court under the new mayor, Zoran Mamdani's watch. Zoe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start by talking about what set the stage for the illegal abduction and kidnapping of President Maduro. And can you give us a little bit of context of what brought us to this moment?
Well, I think when we think about what happened on January 3rd, it is part of a 2 decade campaign against the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela and against its leadership. This siege and campaign of destabilization by the United States against Venezuela, since it chose an alternative path in the 1998 elections when Hugo Chavez was elected, has had many different phases. We can point to a lot of them. Direct coup attempt in 2002, which, briefly Hugo Chavez was unseated, but it was actually People's Power that brought him back to power. But it's had many phases, it's had many chapters. But the last chapter has been one of the most intense. And so after Hugo Chavez died in 2013, the US thought, okay, finally, we're going to actually be able to overthrow this socialist project, this project which tries to use its oil for the betterment of the people. And a very intense campaign was waged against Nicolás Maduro specifically, thinking that, okay, he's not as popular as Chavez, and this is the time to act. And so for the last 11 years, 12 years now, there has been an even more intensified campaign against Venezuela in attempts to destabilize the government, to cripple it through economic sanctions. And so this has all been taking place for the last 12 years within the broader 2 decade campaign against Venezuela. And then, even more micro looking, we can say that the last phase or the latest phase as part of this US campaign against Venezuela was specifically with the latest Donald Trump administration, which continued efforts by the Biden administration and continued already existing attempts by mainstream media to vilify Venezuela, to accuse it of being part of an international drug trafficking network. And this, under Trump, of course, intensified in the last 3 months when there was a massive military deployment to the Caribbean, and these accusations that Cartel de los Soles, that Tren de Aragua are now the most vicious and strongest drug trafficking groups that are threatening the United States. And under that justification, these airstrikes were taking place in the Caribbean, threats almost every single day from Pete Hegseth, from Marco Rubio, from Donald Trump himself, saying that we're going to take action against Venezuela, land strikes, airstrikes, whatever we want to do to quote unquote deal with the problem of Venezuela, whether the problem they decide is drugs or democracy or human rights. And so I think, there's a lot of different chapters to what has been the US campaign against Venezuela, but I think the most important thing to underline here is that it is part of over 2 decades campaign. And so what we saw in the last couple of months is part of that. What we saw on Saturday is part of that. It's not a change in US policy towards Venezuela, but an intensification.
Uh, can you tell us why this intensification has happened? I know it's a longer policy, but can you kind of also set the context for this intensification in the past few weeks?
Well, Donald Trump has made it very clear, whether it's through his tariff policy or whether it's through this declaration of of we're going to deport 10 million immigrants here in the United States, that he does not believe in waiting. He does not believe in following any international norms, any domestic norms, really respecting any laws whatsoever. And so when you see him and Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth kind of looking at the world and assessing U.S. interests and U.S. prospects, they come up with the national security strategy, which was released in November 2025. And it essentially says, we have to take control and reassert our dominance over the Western Hemisphere. And this means, overthrowing, in their eyes, the projects that threaten U.S. dominance in the region. The Western Hemisphere referring to the Americas, referring to what many U.S. leaders have referred to as the U.S.'s backyard, reviving the Monroe Doctrine, which says that the Americas is not for the Europeans, but is for America. And when we say that, we're obviously here referring to the United States. The United States must be the sole power in the Americas to dictate how the resources are used, what political projects are allowed to go forward, and to make sure that this sphere is controlled when the U.S. goes to its greater power conflict with China. So, this intensification, I think it's important to see that it's happening in multiple fronts in terms of the United States realizing actually it can get away with murder. It can get away with violations of international law. We saw it happen with the genocide in Gaza. The U.S. and Israel essentially flaunted every single international norm and law, carrying out a genocide in real time with millions on the streets, with many different states condemning this, but no one really doing anything to really stop it on the world stage. The United Nations has proved ineffective in actually deterring the United States and its allies from taking military action. And so I think once that was really made clear to the United States, what is stopping them from carrying forward their true interests to take back the Western Hemisphere and their vision. And Venezuela and defeating the Bolivarian Revolution is a key step in towards taking back the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. being able to, have access to the largest oil reserves in the entire world. So Venezuela has always been a key piece to the U.S. asserting its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, but also in the world.
You were at the indictment when President Maduro was brought to New York. Tell us what this hearing was like, but also give us a little bit more context of the things that President Maduro said. He did call himself a prisoner of war.
Yeah, so on Monday, Nicolás Maduro Moros and Celia Flores were arraigned before the U.S. court, and the U.S. prosecutors presented a summary of the charges they are raising against the two defendants. This was a massive media show. There were like dozens and dozens of journalists and outlets that were gathered there. I think this has really become a huge center of focus and attention for people within the United States and across the world. The hearing itself lasted about 30 minutes. And again, the summary of the charges against them were presented. And in several occasions, President Maduro used the opportunity to assert, on one hand, that his kidnapping was completely legal, that it took place, during an illegal and unilateral military action against his country that's completely unprovoked, and also that he considers himself a prisoner of war and a political prisoner, and that currently his rights as a head of state and the privileges that he should be afforded in U.S. custody have not in any way been respected. Interestingly, the defense of Celia Flores noted that she suffered several injuries during the abduction, which hadn't been treated. So it was, a moment of a lot of tension, but also a moment of a lot of defiance, that even within a U.S. courtroom, even within the most powerful military power actually abducting you and taking you out of your home to a court where you in no way, in no reason belong there. President Maduro was actually able to assert himself and send signs of strength to his country, which is currently facing a really difficult situation.
Yeah. In the indictment, he's also charged with narco-terrorism, right? So can you kind of break that down? Why charge him with narco-terrorism, and why abduct and kidnap and illegally bring sovereign of a state under these charges?
Well, narco-terrorism is sort of an invented concept, which comes out is something that's kind of created in the past several decades by the United States as it's waging its war on terror and waging its alleged war on drugs, and it's kind of the perfect synthesis of being able to use the greatest tool that it has, which is the war on terror, and everything that waging a war on terror affords you in terms of legal avenues to pursue, to capture, to kill, while using the rhetoric of war on drugs. And what's interesting to note here is that neither is Venezuela a terrorist threat, nor is it a major player in the international drug trade. So most importantly, the charge and the accusation of narco-terrorism is completely false. And the US has showed its hand in not only the indictment itself by not mentioning fentanyl, which has now been classified by the United States as a weapon of mass destruction, if I'm not mistaken, but also, afterwards admitting that Cartel de los Soles is not an actual organization, and that is a slogan that was popularized by different journalists, to refer to some generals even before the Bolivarian Revolution was in power, that were participating and complicit in different drug trafficking operations. But it is no way this massive threat to the American way of life that it's been allegedly painted in hegemonic media and even by the spokespersons of the U.S. federal government.
I know we briefly spoke about the violations in international law. Can you tell us a little bit? Can you just expand on that? The various ways in which the abduction, the indictment, and the charges have played out, especially in violation of international law.
Well, on one hand, you can't kidnap a sovereign head of state. It's like all of these like really basic things. U.S. law being used extraterritorially. The U.S. is now feels backed into a corner because the day after, or even within the hours after the operation had taken place, we see Vice President J.D. Vance saying to all of those who are saying that this was illegal, let me tell you that the U.S. has charges against these two individuals for different sort of crimes that they have allegedly committed. So, first of all, just because a U.S. court believes that someone in another country has violated a law does not give them the right to then capture them and then bring them to their country to be tried. That is not how the law works. Second of all, there's zero presumption of influence. I mean, innocence. There's all of the legal, basic legal tenets that exist in U.S. law and international law that are completely being overridden. There's the violation of even the Constitution, where the U.S. took military action against another country without consulting Congress. And this act in itself has provoked the ire of even people in the Republican Party, because they know that this, Trump has already said, and he told the New York Times in an interview this week, that he only feels accountable to his own moral compass. He doesn't feel accountable to Congress. He doesn't feel accountable to the U.S. judiciary, which essentially is an admission that he has no problem violating all of the laws that are set in place. So there's the violations of U.S. law, there's violations of international law, and it is setting a new precedent. I think it's important to point out that there are cases where the U.S. has extradition agreements and where there is cooperation and where there's joint investigations. This is not one of those cases. When Juan Orlando Hernandez was extradited to the United States, it was a completely different situation. Juan Orlando Hernandez faces charges in his own country, and he was, eventually arrested and extradited to the United States. So there has to be some sort of, there's the United States and all of their talking heads have said, well, we had the right to do this. We were a, but really, if you think about it, can any other country with complete impunity just decide to be the judge and the jury of people in other countries? No, it is not correct. And essentially what the US wants to say is that their law is international law. And that in itself is also completely false.
Yeah. We also have a statement from the newly minted Mayor Mamdani, who, in his statement after President Maduro's arrest, says that the blatant pursuit of regime change does not just affect those abroad, it directly impacts New Yorkers, including tens of thousands of Venezuelans who call the city their home. And of course, he's going on to say that their safety is important to him. But could you kind of comment on his statement about, one, the regime change, but also the local ramifications? How does this affect the safety of the city, the Venezuelans in the city? Can you kind of like talk to us about that?
Well, I think it's important that members of the Democratic Party, including Zoran Mamdani, have condemned, the illegal action that the United States took. It's notable that currently the case still is being heard in the U.S. In the New York Southern District Court, which is a federal court, of course. If this Trump would, of course, like this to be changed because New York is not necessarily the best jury pool for this kind of case. He would much prefer that it take place in Miami. But on one hand, there is the fact that Maduro is being held in New York City. So there's the impact in terms of, him being illegally held, having been illegally kidnapped, and now, his own illegal incarceration is taking place in New York City. And I think it's safe to say that tens of thousands of New Yorkers do not agree with the fact that he is being held here and that he is being held at all. There has been, on one hand, the Trump administration says that we will take military action against Venezuela. We have no problems doing that. But on the other hand, they're saying, first of all, he said that Venezuelans are the ugliest people he's ever met. And second of all, his administration has been the administration leading the charge against Venezuelan immigrants. It was his administration that deported 250 Venezuelans to El Salvador, many of those people simply for having tattoos. And so, of course, if any more military action takes place against Venezuela, we can already assume there will be, impacts in terms of immigration, impacts in terms of people having to flee their homes. I mean, there were bombings in civilian areas, and the right-wing administration that is in office in the United States essentially has been weaponizing Venezuelan migrants to say, look how dangerous they are, look how bad they are. I mean, even yesterday there was a shooting in Portland of 2 people by ICE, and the administration is coming out now to say that, oh, well, they were just Venezuelan and they were members of Tren de Aragua. So you have, on one hand, they're criminalizing Venezuelan immigrants, but on the other hand, fomenting a situation that will create further immigration. And so you can see how these both kind of feed into each other, because Venezuelans have been the scapegoats in a lot of ways for a lot of xenophobic rhetoric. They've been the test case, the guinea pigs for illegal treatment of migrants. I mean, completely violating due process, deporting them to a third country and holding them in a horrific concentration camp known as CCOT. So Venezuelans have been at and the Venezuelan people have been at the butt of the US policy, whether it's here in the United States and the mass deportation campaign and the horrific media vilification campaign that we saw against Venezuelans even before Trump was in office. And then at the same time, fomenting this idea that everyone in Venezuela, including the president, are drug traffickers. And that seeks to create the ground for people not to care about Venezuelan migrants when their rights are violated, and to not really protest when any of this happens. So it's really important that Venezuelan people are seen as human, not only if they're celebrating the kidnapping of Maduro, because it seems that those are the only Venezuelan people that the Trump administration and mainstream media seems to care about. They don't seem to care about the Venezuelan migrants who are being deported, and they don't seem to care about the fact that civilian areas were bombed by the United States military.
Yeah. Now, in the absence, in the aftermath of the kidnapping, Venezuela now has a new president in office. And how do you view this new power transition? And again, there's been a lot of talk about making deals, insider deals, but tell us a little bit more about what's happening in the new president's office.
Well, I think it's really important to address those accusations, and there's been a lot of talk both from Trump himself,
Mm.
from Western media, and even people on the left saying that somehow the illegal kidnapping of Maduro was some negotiated deal or some backroom deal. Of course, this is completely false, given the fact and the that, for example, 32 Cubans and 20 Venezuelan soldiers were killed defending Maduro. The death toll, as of now, as of yesterday, actually, is over 100 from the U.S. attacks. So I think, first of all, it's really important to say off the bat that what happened on Saturday was not some sort of betrayal or some sort of sellout, but it was a military operation carried out by the most lethal army in in the world, and notably, several U.S. soldiers were injured during the operation. So it's important to clarify that. And of course, as most political systems go, when the president is unable to serve, the vice president takes over. And so Delcy Rodriguez has been sworn in as interim president in Venezuela. And in every single statement and public address that she's given, she has not only, of course, called for the release and immediate return of Maduro, and denounced the U.S. military operation against her country, but also reaffirmed the continuity of the Bolivarian Revolution. And there has been announcements of several deals that have been made. And I think it's really important to note that on one hand, the Venezuelan government has been in talks with the United States for several years. And so there have already been negotiations on the release of, for example, people being held in prison in Venezuela, US companies being allowed to operate in Venezuela. And so what we're seeing now, of course, is those same negotiations happening, which had actually been called off by the Trump administration in July. Richard Grenell was told that he couldn't go back there. He was the US envoy for the talks with Venezuela. Now those talks are resuming, but under very different conditions. Under the conditions of there being 15,000 US troops stationed in the Caribbean, several warships, and essentially an armada and an oil blockade. And so now the US is in a much better position to demand greater conditions for the United States. So what's happening now is really more of a continuation of what Venezuela was engaged in before. They want sanctions relief. They want an end to US threats, and they want to really be able to live free and in dignity. And so those negotiations will surely continue, but it's important to note that they are taking place with Venezuela having its back against the wall, having a gun to its head. And so I think they're doing everything possible to avoid further military escalation and further lives being lost.
I want to come back to President Rodriguez when she's been giving a series of press conferences, and one of the things that she describes is that She described the US military operations capturing President Maduro as having Zionist undertones. And this she said on the televised press conference on the 3rd of January. Again, she's in the over the last few days, she's again repeated that, calling the attack a Zionist attack, and of course demanding President Maduro's release. What does it mean for her to call these both as Zionist undertones or Zionist attacks? What is the Israel connection here when we think about the kidnapping?
Well, I think what's interesting is to compare the way in which many different strikes against, for example, Hezbollah have taken place, of the U.S. and Israel working with the United States to be able to issue constant threats against the leadership, and then having the exact coordinates to carry out horrific attacks. I think that what's being evoked here is the reality that when Israel is carrying out these attacks against Lebanon, against Syria, against Yemen, and of course against Palestine, first of all, it has the complete backing of the United States, and second of all, it's operating as a much far superior military power to its adversaries. The United States is responsible for more than 75% of world military spending, has a budget of over 1 trillion. It works hand in hand with its allies in NATO and, of course, with Israel, essentially as a united unit. We can't say today that Europe has any different agenda than the United States. It has made that very, very clear. So the United States, when it does these sort of attacks, Israel, when it does these attacks, it has an upper hand that is not even really fair at all. And this is a new factor in terms of today's world. There is no country that has the capacity to confront Israel or the United States militarily. So I think that this idea of this complete asymmetrical warfare is really important to keep in mind. The Venezuelan people were bombed in the middle of the night, not having made any attack against any nation, not having ever threatened the United States, having demanded dialogue, and yet the United States, being a completely superior military power, essentially lays siege to the capital. And I think this is like a very clear connection in that sense of this asymmetrical warfare, to be able to say, we know exactly where you are at all times, and we have no trouble using lethal force to achieve our aims.
That brings us to Maria Mercado, who is not only the most recent recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, but also someone who has publicly praised the US operations that seized President Maduro. She's called it as dismantling the narco-terrorist structures, and consistently keeps praising Netanyahu in US public media appearances. What is the local perceptions back home in Venezuela about Mercado, and how does she resonate to the locals when she is seen as one praising this, but also how does she fare in terms of her ideology and politics in Venezuela to the local people on the ground?
Well, interestingly enough, Donald Trump made it very clear to anyone who had any doubts that Maria Corina Machado is not popular, and she does not have viability as a political leader within Venezuela. And that's why in the press conference on Saturday, January 3rd, he said, well, actually, we're going to run the country because she's not very popular in Venezuela. So I think if Trump is saying that she's not popular in Venezuela, I think we have to take his word on that. She is a divisive figure. She has been, essentially an opposition leader in some respects since the Bolivarian Revolution triumphed, since Hugo Chavez won the election. She comes from a family of elites. Her father, I think, was very active in the steel sector, which worked with multinational companies. Of course, felt immediately the impacts of a socialist-oriented government. She is someone who called possible military actions against her own country an act of love. She has consistently advocated for sanctions, which really are unilateral coercive measures, which were responsible for tanking the Venezuelan economy and causing countless lives to be lost, whether it's through, lack of access to medicine and other crucial medical supplies. So she's someone who said, I have no problem with the United States waging hybrid warfare on my country so long as I'm benefiting. And she has benefited greatly. She won the Nobel Peace Prize this year. She's now seen as kind of this renegade, right wing, example for a lot of people in the region and even across the world. But it's very clear that the Venezuelan people do not respect her, and they know that she is not actually looking out for their needs or their interests. She's barely feigned, this idea that she is somehow out for the people. She's made it very clear that, I mean, once you say that another country should bomb your own country, it's pretty clear that you're not really caring about the people within your country. So she's been completely discredited, and the fact that even the United States has kind of tossed her out is would be comical if it weren't in the context of such atrocious actions taking place.
So I have one last question for you. One of the things that has been quite alarming is also how the US media has covered not only the various actions against Venezuela, but also the recent kidnapping. You run and you're an editor at People's Dispatch. And often when you are an editor and a journalist, but as an editor and a journalist, when you see the mainstream framing, how would you break that down for people who might not know anything about Venezuela, whose only knowledge or access to information about all of this comes from your mainstream? Could you maybe give us or break down the key red flags, but also what are the things that we should be looking out for?
There's a lot there, for sure. But I
That
think
needs another
it's a really
episode.
very important. Well, since this has been the latest kind of charge, I think, uh, this idea that the mainstream media has completely adopted, which is really just a talking point of Donald Trump, is this idea that Venezuela is the leader in an international drug trafficking network. If that were the case, then why does the Drug Enforcement Agency not even mention Cartel de los Soles in its 2025 report and only dedicate 2 paragraphs to Tren de Aragua? Um, it just doesn't actually add up to say that Venezuela is the key node in international drug trafficking. And all of the US agencies in their reports make this very clear. Venezuela is not the major node of production, it's not the major node of transit. And you can look at US agency reports, UN reports that clearly show this. So I think the first thing is debunking this idea that Venezuela is somehow this drug trafficking haven. That's on one hand. Secondly, would be this idea that, somehow the economic crisis in Venezuela is just because there's some greedy and corrupt leaders in Venezuela, and that Maduro is just a really, really bad guy. And he's just so corrupt. Well, why is it that the economic crisis reaches its worst point in 2018, in 2019, right after the United States sanctions Venezuela's oil sector? That is the most simple question to start kind of debunking that. Why is it that over 1,000 sanctions have been imposed on Venezuela? President Barack Obama declared that Venezuela was a threat to US national security. That was in 2015, and I think still holds no water, but this was the legal framework under which the US has been able to impose countless sanctions, which have destroyed the Venezuelan economy. So, people are constantly saying, well, the situation there is so bad, so many people have had to leave. And it's like, yes, and that is because of US sanctions. When you are an oil producing country that relies on oil for your wealth, like many countries in the world, it's not just Venezuela, when your oil sector faces intense sanctions from your major partner in production, that's going to have an impact on your economy. And it doesn't take an economist, it doesn't take an academic to understand that. And if you look at US reports, if you look at the New York Times, if you look at the Washington Post, they will almost never mention sanctions when talking about Venezuela. And if they do, they'll say, well, government supporters say it's just about sanctions, but that's not true. I mean, it can't, it doesn't, that's just complete ridiculousness. And then I think there's another aspect that's talking about democracy. And, on one hand, Venezuela has an incredibly vibrant democracy. They've had over 25 elections since 1999. They have a communal, system. They have local participation. They have many different avenues of how people are actually involved in politics in a way that would blow people's minds in the United States, because our political participation is so limited to voting every 4 or 2 years, and then not being able to demand anything of our representatives, even though they use our tax dollars for war and for policing. In Venezuela, they actually have a say over how the money gets used and what they want for their communities. So on one hand, the idea that there's no democracy in Venezuela is a lie, and on the other hand, let's say there were no democracy, which again I'm not saying is true. That still doesn't give the United States a reason
Absolutely.
to invade and kidnap its president.
Yeah. Zoe, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the work you do.
Thanks so much for having me.